And following that, it's my great pleasure and honour to introduce our keynote for this morning, Professor Robert Bob Ursano. Bob's a giant, as we all know, in the field of traumatic stress and military mental health, and we're very honoured to have him with us this morning. He's Professor of Psychiatry and Neuroscience and Director of the Centre of Traumatic Stress Studies at the Uniformed Services University, School of Medicine, Bethesda, Maryland. He's had 20 years of service in the US Air Force and retired as Colonel in 1991. Dr. Ursano served as the Department of Defence representative to the National Advisory Mental Health Council of the National Institute of Mental Health in the US and a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He's a frequent advisor on issues surrounding psychological response to trauma to the highest levels of the US government, specifically the Department of Defence leadership. He was the first chairman of the American Psychiatric Association's Committee on Psychiatric Dimensions of Disaster, and an invited participant to the White House Mental Health Conference in 1999. He's won many awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award of the ISTSS, the International Trauma Society, the Humanitarian Achievement Award for the Department of Defence, and the William Menninger Award, American College of Physicians, for fundamental contributions to the understanding of mental health. He's had over 300 publications, and the second edition of his tremendous seminal book, a textbook on disaster psychiatry, is about to be released. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bob Ursano.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Tony and Minister Tehan. It's an honor to be here. Coming to Australia, to borrow a phrase, and talking about traumatic stress is truly bringing coals to Newcastle. The depth of leadership in science, in advocacy, and in politics on the question of the management, treatment, and way forward of those exposed to trauma in Australia has been tremendous for decades and decades. David mentioned our new book that is out. He didn't mention that Beverly Raphael is my co-editor on that book and has been a colleague for a long time. It's a pleasure to be here with David and Sandy and later Richard and others. So what I'm going to try and do is avoid talking about any Australian sport. I've been alerted to that there is a substantial contest occurring or beginning soon, and it's from something that I have no knowledge of other than it looks very dangerous. Something called Australian football, and it has a funny ball. Strange. But what I'm going to try to do is make an allusion to, let me choose American baseball, because the ball's round. It's easy to throw, and not too bad to catch. But what I hope to cover is the who, when, and where of trauma, not the treatment, although I enjoy talking about that, but that's not what I'm going to focus on. But one might think about that as a baseball, traumatic stress. The baseball has a height, a width, and a depth to it, right? 3 dimensions. But we often forget that in truth, a baseball also has a trajectory attached to it when it's thrown. And in addition, not only a trajectory, but also a piece of time is captured when a baseball is thrown. So I would say that a baseball has 5 dimensions, right? Height, width, depth, trajectory, and time. Time you can best capture by the idea of course, take out your iPhone or other phone and forget to push the button, but hold it down, and all of a sudden you've got click, 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 and you have captured time in each moment. So to understand PTS, which is a great term because it is an umbrella term, we need to better probe its dimensions, and that's what I'm going to talk about. For over, and I believe this mic is working, and I believe they said I could wander, so I may wander a bit because it's dark looking out there, and it may help you, but it'll help me. So when we think of war, the past more than a decade in the United States and with Australia and with our other NATO allies has been engaged in one of the most traumatic wars we have had, not perhaps by total numbers, certainly, but by its variety, its spread, its ongoing corrosiveness in our society. We have seen new types of traumatic stress occur, and we're going to talk some about those. So to begin with, when we think of trauma, we in our group, as do many others, put it with disaster, and trauma and disaster form a whole. And in fact, war is one particular type of disaster. It is one of the human-made disasters. Much like hurricane, which we are now dealing with in the United States, as having just had Harvey and now facing Irma, is a natural disaster. That classification in itself can aid us in beginning to think about what may be the results of exposure to those particular types of events. When we think of those exposures, or we might think of this slide, and I think of it as actually the most important thing for you to take home, which is going to be a reminder for the vast majority of you. It is what comprises post-traumatic stress, or what comprises mental health responses to trauma, disaster, combat, and war. This particular slide we put together as part of the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences work shortly after 2001 in the United States. And what it illustrates is that PTSD is one psychiatric illness over here, but there are others. And maybe PTSD isn't even the most important one, although we spend lots of time trying to understand it. If you ask what most people who actually have a response that is a mental health response, it actually is distress responses. And those incur what's the most common type of presentation in the emergency room in the United States after 9/11, which was not PTS, not acute stress disorder, but it was sleep disturbances and the management of sleep disturbances. Similarly, issues such as believing that you were exposed versus actually being exposed. The belief itself carries a risk with it. In the other corner are things that we often forget about, which are health risk behaviors, things that we actually do, regardless of whether or not in itself we would think of it as a disease or disorder, such as we don't think of increased alcohol consumption, not alcohol abuse or alcohol addiction, but just increased drinking. Well, increased drinking, as well as increased smoking, both of legal and illegal substances, occurs after exposure to traumatic events. Both of those carry a morbidity risk with them. Increased drinking increases motor vehicle accidents as well as family violence. Both of those have a road following exposure to traumatic stress. Now, having said all this, you all know to remember that, in fact, most people will, in fact, do quite fine after they're exposed to a traumatic event. That resilience is, in fact, the most common response, and it speaks to the strength of the human spirit more than anything else we could ever imagine. So, what do we already know? Old news. Old news we know we don't need to discover again, but we do, which is the more exposure to have to any type of traumatic event, the more likely you are to have, in this case, PTSD. But that's true for other mental health problems as well. Exposure, the amount of exposure, how much you are exposed to. This particular slide shows firefights and rates of PTSD. This was part of Charles Hoag's work, which has been a tremendous contribution to understanding responses to war, particularly in the United States Army. And what is unique about it, it has been in real time. It's not after the war that Charles led this effort. Well, guess what? Not new news to us. This is actually from World War II. And the top line is wounded and killed in action. The bottom line is psychiatric casualties. You don't need a correlation coefficient to notice that, in fact, they move in the same direction. One goes up, the other one goes up. We've known that the amount of exposure you have to the worst outcomes you will have for a long time. Well, remember I talked about that baseball? Or to get a little or closer, because I know my kids played it when they were little, soccer. I can venture to soccer, that there is a trajectory to the course of the symptoms that one has. This is a stylized version from a while back, but you'll notice that symptoms can occur and stay chronic, can occur and come down. They can go up a little bit and come down, or maybe they actually show up later on. Of course, this has now been looked at multiple times empirically, and for one example, here's one of Richard Bryan's, which in fact the data supports the idea of what one would expect, that like any medical condition, it can wax and wane over time, whether or not that's arthritis or multiple sclerosis, or in fact, hypertension. Your blood pressure goes up and down. Another piece of the story of trauma that may be forgotten is, what about where we live? That we know, an often stated fact, is that the best predictor of your health, overall health, and mine, of all the predictors we have, is where you live, your zip code. Your zip code is a tremendous predictor of your health, because it speaks to what you are exposed to. It speaks to how often you have fresh vegetables versus eat Twinkies for breakfast. It speaks to what is the probability that you will be in a motor vehicle accident or be a victim of a crime. Well, we could ask the same question in terms of mental health. We could say, how does your zip code influence your mental health? This particular study is one that we did in Florida, 2004, 2005, when there were a series of actually 5 hurricanes, 2 were tropical storms, that went through Florida. And we studied the public health system and those people that were the first responders to these hurricanes. What we wanted to know about, one piece of the story, was what is your neighborhood like? There's a wonderful measure, not often enough used, called collective efficacy. Collective efficacy is a bit like, in fact, what's the probability if you went next door and asked somebody for a cup of sugar that you'd be able to get it? How friendly are your neighbors? How much do they take care of each other? It's a concept well developed by James Sampson at Harvard, was used to predict violence in Chicago. So if you go in the neighborhoods and you ask people to score this kind of question about their neighborhood, you can get a score for collective efficacy. So these are 2 lines. This is collective efficacy, better collective efficacy. This is the probability of having PTSD for any given person. And this is the zip code level. So what we did, we asked everybody to tell us their scores. We put it together. We came up with a score for their zip code. Not exactly what the individual said, but what their average zip code was. And this is for people that had a high degree of injury or a low degree of injury. Regardless of which you had, the better your collective efficacy, the lower, in fact, the probability of having PTSD, the stronger your community. That your community itself is an important component of whether or not you will get post-traumatic stress disorder. Not your variables, but those of everybody around you combined together. Well, what else do we know? One of the things we know, which is a tremendous burden for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, from whichever war, has been the question of stigma and barriers to care. This is, again, a study from Charles Hoag's work, and it asks questions such as, I would be seen as weak if I said I had a mental health problem. My unit leadership might see me differently. And you'll see the distinction up here is for people who screen positive for having PTSD or other mental health problems. They actually scored the barriers much higher. It would harm my career. So stigma, barriers to care is probably a better word. Stigma, we don't really know how to define it. We know it's there, but it's a collective term. But the bad news story is that actually if you asked in the United States, and this is one of Ron Kessler's, who we'll hear about a little later as well, his work from the National Comorbidity Study, you would see that in the United States, stigma is not unique to the military, of course. If you have a mental health problem, you will feel stigmatized. In fact, our military services, and I know this is true of yours as well, are making great advances beyond where the rest of our civilian population is in terms of altering the barriers and stigma and in terms of getting people to care. Well, DSM-5, those of you that are treaters and involved in care will know that that's the US development of ICD-10, ICD-11. They sort of cross-map, but they don't totally cross-map in terms of our diagnostic manual that tells us how to diagnose things. It's relatively new. There are some things that are new in it that will help us think about these issues of, remember that baseball? Height, width, depth, trajectory, time. So what are the dimensions to think about? Excuse me. Perhaps one of the most important elements in the DSM-5 chapter is that in addition, PTSD falls into its own section, trauma and stressor-related disorders. Notice it says, and stressor-related disorders. That was probably the most important addition that was accomplished, in my view, in terms of DSM-5, because it says there will be others. There are others. It's not a chapter that says PTSD. It says other stressor-related disorders. We'll return to that as well. So one of the elements within the new diagnosis of PTSD is to begin to think about other dimensions within this disorder. We now have a subtype because there's sufficient data to talk about a subtype of PTSD, which is related to having the prominent symptoms of dissociation. There are other elements within the chapter. Acute stress disorder, which is how the immediate responses occur over the first 3 to 5 days after exposure. We no longer think that, in fact, dissociation is required. Much of the work on that done here in Australia. We used to hope that dissociation would be the key element that would say if you had dissociation, you got PTSD later. If you didn't have dissociation, you didn't get PTSD later. Not true. We know that dissociation is important, can be present, but it's not the sine qua non of developing PTSD. Well, remember that other phrase? We're going to begin to start a drumbeat on other. One of the others, there was sufficient information available, 2 different researchers, prominent, thoughtful people, working much on, you would perhaps recognize most easily as traumatic grief. But in the politics of the world, we didn't want to choose names. So it ended up with this horrendous name, persistent complex bereavement disorder. But what it is grief. Not yet a diagnosis, but it's been proposed as something to study, research, and potentially become a diagnosis, meaning grief that has persisted for a long time, generally more than 12 months, and it's prominent in impairing function. Well, what's this one? Another other. Our group was the first to identify, subsequently identified by 3 other groups, that during our most recent war, rates of child neglect went up. So now think of child neglect as an other of trauma and stressor-related disorders. This particular slide has to do with children age 1 to 2. We were able to see it all the way up through age 10. In families with children up to age 10, child neglect increased. Now, is that so strange? Some of you, I'm sure, work with families and would be alert to the idea that the strongest predictor of child neglect is being a single parent. Single parent families have increased rates of child neglect. There's almost there is a limited amount of time, energy, and caring that one person can have, and in fact, two can have a little more than one. We ran the experiment you'd never be allowed to run, your IRB would never allow it during a war, which is to deploy members of families, essentially creating single-parent families. And what did we find? Child neglect goes up. So child neglect might well be, and should be, one of our other disorders. I would put an Australian dollar or US dollar on a bet that following disasters, child neglect also goes up. Well, let's go back to PTSD, the first part of that sentence before we get to the other. PTSD is not uncommon after many types of traumatic events, as you all know. And maybe nearly everybody has the acute form of PTSD sometime in their lifetime. So if you were in a motor vehicle accident, and for several months after that motor vehicle accident, you had a little bit trouble sleeping, you jumped when the brakes came on behind you, you decided to take some days off from work, and you didn't want to go and watch the races, either on TV or in person. And maybe you also felt a little sad and discombobulated. Well, you had PTSD. One of the problems we have in the whole field of mental health is that we define our disorders by including impairment. Now, let me tell you why that's a problem. It's a help to us in thinking about who needs treatment, but it isn't necessarily a help to us in thinking about the pathology of a disease. So if you go in to see your doctor and he gives you a physical, and in giving you the physical, he gives you a chest x-ray, and he says, "Did you know you have a broken rib right over here? Has that ever bothered you?" "No." "Does it hurt when you breathe?" "No." You still have a broken rib, regardless of whether or not you were impaired, you had any pain, or whether or not you took off time from work. A disease is defined by the disease process. We add the idea of impairment, which can include pain or taking off time for work, because we don't yet understand our pathologies well enough. But in fact, to understand the disease, we don't want that pathology word in there. Well, what is PTSD? Here's where we get to go on what I think of as Christopher Robin's trip with Pooh on a journey down the road. How might you conceptualize post-traumatic stress disorder? And these things, which are somewhat metaphorical, tremendously influence what questions we ask in order to investigate it scientifically, and they also influence things like policy. Which one of these is the way you think about it will determine which policies you think are appropriate. So you might think that PTSD is actually the inability to digest early stress. That it's a bit like we have impaired digestion, that everybody gets some symptoms, and some people digest it well, and others don't. It would lead you to think about what are the digestive mechanisms of our psychology. How do we, in fact, quiet ourselves? It would also lead you to think of what are the digestive mechanisms of our brain. How do we quiet our brain after it's been aroused? Well, another possibility, if you think for a moment about a bar of steel. If I had a bar of steel and I was trying to bend it, and where's it very hot in Australia? Where? Okay. So if I was in Darwin and I want to bend a thing of steel, I would have one set of equations that would tell me how, in fact, steel bends when it's hot. But if I took that same steel and I took it to the South Pole and wanted to write the equation, the steel would still have an equation that said how it would bend, but the equation would be different. So how does that relate to PTSD? Well, after you return from war, Carl Castro and others in the United States used the term of battle mind. The one comes back with battle mind. You are alert to threats, you are alert to a bag by the side of the road, you jump, you startle, you are in fact a threat identifying organism. Absolutely correct for your brain in the environment in battle. It's been set to a new spot. The problem then becomes, how do you change the set point back so that the equations that predicted behavior that are in an environment without battle are operating again, rather than the equations from in battle? Another picture. In PTSD, you all know that we have in DSM-5 intrusion, avoidance, arousal, negative cognitions, sets of symptoms. But we only talk about PTSD when you have all of those, not just any one. So maybe PTSD is the glue that actually makes the force stick. If you just get intrusion and it goes away, you just get avoidance, it goes away. But some people, they all stick when they're there. So really our treatment is then going to be to deal with the glue, not with the symptoms. How come some people, they all stick? And we should target our treatments to the glue. Well, here's my favorite. This is Zambezi. Walking beside Zambezi, Congo felt very happy. I have a super memory, he said to himself, and I will always remember what to forget. Many in our group find it helpful to think of PTSD as a forgetting disorder. Not a memory disorder, but a forgetting disorder. It's our impairment in the ability to forget that may lead us to post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, forgetting gets a bad rap because we're primarily preoccupied with things like Alzheimer's. And we think forgetting is a bad thing. But actually, forgetting is probably much more important to us than remembering. You are forgetting all the time. If you didn't, your heads would explode. We're constantly taking in information. The processes for forgetting are a critical aspect of our function. Impaired forgetting can become a disorder. And one wants to understand, what are the processes of forgetting? What is normal forgetting? What is impaired forgetting? What increases the probability of impaired forgetting? And PTSD might then be such an impaired disorder. Well, here's another, and then we'll have one more slide that kind of summarizes. There are a lot of them. We did a study after an explosion on a Navy ship, gun turret number 2 actually, on the USS Iowa. And those sailors who died, their bodies were brought back to Dover Air Force Base. There are 2 large mortuaries in the United States for the military on each coast. Those have now recently been consolidated. And there were volunteers who came to the mortuary to help process the bodies. So think of these as first responders. And in fact, we've done similar studies and others that are exposed to dead bodies. Dead bodies are an aspect of trauma, they're an aspect of war. Understanding what exposure to a dead body does to a person can help us across all kinds of trauma events. So if you ask those people that were working around the death and the dead, did you have any thoughts about, it could have been me? Or did you have any thoughts about, it could have been my brother, could have been my sister, could have been my father? Something we talked about in our group as sort of like identification, identifying with the dead. Those people that said yes were 4 times more likely to develop PTSD. So if you had the emotional experience, one might also think of it as empathy, you are at greater risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder from that one cognition. The cognitive process puts you at increased risk. One of my friends, somewhat jokingly, but only somewhat, said, "Bob, this is really an autoimmune disorder then." It's where something that normally protects you, which is what identification does. You identify with your father, you identify with your mother, you identify with those that are important to you, and it helps you grow. But in this case, identification has turned against you. It is, in fact, working against your health growing processes, like an autoimmune disorder, when in fact, what's supposed to fight off infection is actually damaging your own body. Arthritis elements have autoimmune disorders and many other disorders. Thyroid disorder, there is a piece that is autoimmune. All right, so what is PTSD? There are other ways to think about it. These ways of thinking influence how we respond, how we treat, whether or not we have empathy for a patient, and what policies we develop. They are not trivial. They organize all types of approaches. Which set of these you are working in as either a clinician, a policy person, an advocate, or a scientist defines your work. And it's not like one is right and the other isn't, but they help us ask lots of good questions. Others might be, maybe PTSD is fear-organized behaviors. Another that's helpful for policy people is toxic exposure. I grew up in the Air Force military. Thinking about toxic exposures is very familiar to commanders. You could talk about it as, you know, it's like toxic exposure. They were around the fumes too much. Event-related disorders. This, I think, holds the greatest promise in the long term, but the most complicated. An event happens and you change. We think of trauma and something changes. But there may be other ways that we can tie things that happen to what changes in us and our body. My original work in joining into the question of trauma was built around the question of how do people change after exposure to trauma? Not how did they become ill, but how did they change? And what were the mechanisms of change? Then, of course, let's not forget, there is a neurobiology underlying all this. It's happening in our brain. So maybe the right definition is prefrontal cortex hippocampal amygdala disorder. Makes for a good PCHAD. At some point, we'll get to that and be able to use that, regardless of which treatments we use, by understanding, does this person have the capital letter prefrontal cortex, small letter hippocampal, large amygdala disorder? Or do they have the small prefrontal, small hippocampal, large amygdala disorder? We aren't there yet, but we will be. As you all know, we've learned a lot about genetics, and we've come to a reasonable belief that where at one point we thought we had 100,000 or so genes, we're now over here somewhere around 22, 23,000 genes that are in us, and that they help define who we are, but they don't define all of who we are. I always like to remind folks, let's not get too proud over here. The grape has 30,000 genes, and the chicken 16,000. So it's not like we're leading the race in terms of genes. We know that genes and PTSD are a hot area of discovery. Many, in a good number in our group and in some of the large-scale studies that we're working on, have recently published the largest ever gene study of PTSD, 20,000 people. And what did we find? Sorry to say, nothing that we're going to beat the drum too loud about. In smaller scale studies, there are several studies indicating genes that relate to inflammation, like arthritis, or using your muscles too much and how they get inflamed, have also been discovered related to PTSD. Serotonin transporter gene, FKBP5, P11, BDNF, TOL, and many others. But in the world of schizophrenia, with looking at over 100,000 people, we've recently been able to show, not us, but others, 120 genes involved in schizophrenia. As a model, think about we have far to go in PTSD, from 20,000 to 100,000 to do the studies, and that we aren't looking for a gene. We're looking for multiple genes involved. And of course, we're also looking for what turns those genes on and off, what we call the epigenetics. There are things that actually tell a gene whether or not it's supposed to work or whether it's supposed to be quiet. That's why your heart and your liver are different. They have exactly the same genes. The genes aren't different. What's different is which ones have been told to work and which ones have been told to be quiet. And we need to understand that as well. One of the efforts we're working on in what we call the STARS study will be a whole genome sequencing of 40,000 soldiers to begin to look at both the methylome and larger examples of PTSD. Another study by Richard to remind us that our treatments, regardless of what they are, this was one using CBT, treating those with PTSD and including fMRI images, can show changes in the brain. So don't get confused that because you treat by psychotherapy, that doesn't mean brain isn't involved, nor get confused by you study the brain and therefore it's not important to you in terms of psychotherapeutic treatments. There are lots of treatment controversies, and this is a very limited list of things one could wonder about. Debriefing or psychological first aid, EMDR, CBT, use benzodiazepines, don't use them, SSRIs, don't forget, what about psychodynamics, group therapy, IPT, CBT? We have lots of questions. But the most important part of treatment, I think, for us to remember, is that when we treat, we don't treat PTSD. That's the same for other medical disorders, myocardial infarction, multiple sclerosis, back pain. Our treatments span a range of whether or not we are treating the symptoms of the disorder or the core elements of the disorder, or whether or not we're targeting our treatment to some impairment the person's having. They have disc problems and can't get out of a chair. How do we teach them how to get out of a chair? Or they can't get a job and they have PTSD. Or do we treat the other comorbid disorders that they have? Or do we treat the trajectory? One of the roads of treatment that there is a great deal of opportunity for improvement is in treatment and getting to treatment. The military is far ahead of the civilian world. The best data we have in terms of the United States is that only about 65% of people get to treatment that have PTSD, and the average length of time may be as much as 12 years. In the military, yours and mine, we're pushing that to months or 1 year, 2 years, and of course there are those that don't reach for a long time. Well, let's look a little bit at that other in our remaining time. And now we'll home in on some more current work. Between 2004 and 2009, and actually continuing till 2012, the rates of suicide in the US Army went up. Prior to this war, being in the Army was protective from suicide. In fact, if you were a soldier in the Army, your probability of suicide was half that of your civilian age, gender-matched cohort. But the rates went up to and beyond that of civilian-matched cohorts. That was particularly true for the Army, which you'll see here, and the Marines, not so much for the Air Force, very little for the Navy. Well, what about before? In the past, we know that one type of symptomatic behavior associated with depression, either neurotic or psychotic in type, is suicide. Between July 1940 and June 1946, there were 2,000, These figures represent a sharp drop. That was World War II. And we thought we had the answer. The answer was because we screen people better, we treat people better, and maybe they have other ways of taking out being angry by shooting at other people instead of shooting at themselves. We thought we had solved the suicide issue. We didn't. Suicide has become, in the United States, the largest cause of unintentional morbidity and mortality. It now surpasses the rates of motor vehicle accidents. But what do we know about suicide? Remember, we're talking about the other now, other. Matt Nock, who's part of our team on the STARS study, wonderful person, psychologist at Harvard, and one of the deep researchers and thinkers in the world of suicide. In looking at the WHO data, suicide is among the leading causes of death and disease burden around the world, although there have been significant advances in suicide research as well as increases in treatment. The rate of suicidal behavior has not changed. In the United States, there are 8.3 million adults who have serious thoughts of committing suicide every year. There are about 1.1 million attempts of suicide. There are more attempts of suicide than there are first heart attacks. To repeat, there are more suicide attempts each year than there are first heart attacks in the United States. Well, what do we understand? Suicide ideation, a wide number of mental disorders predict suicide ideation. We're not too bad at actually predicting suicide ideation. But the idea of predicting who will attempt is much more challenging. We know depression predicts suicide ideation, but not suicide plans or attempts. In fact, the better predictors of suicide attempt are anxiety disorders and impulse control disorders. Now, why is that important? If you're in primary care, you're a primary care provider for general medical care, frequently your target in the world of suicidality is thoughts. And you identify, in particular, people who are depressed as having suicide ideation, although it occurs with other mental disorders. If you are a mental health care provider, you are working in a population of people that have high rates of suicide ideation. And then the question is, among those with suicide ideation, who's going to attempt? And that's where we have very little information. The Army STAR study to assess risk resilience in service members is one of the largest studies ever undertaken in suicide. It's been thought of and framed as the Framingham study for mental health. You may recall the Framingham cardiac studies, which began in the late 1940s. Late 1940s, we thought your correct blood pressure was take your age and add 100. We didn't know about cholesterol. We didn't change your diet. That's only in the past couple decades. So the study has many different components. I'm going to focus on 3 of them. Overall, there are 100,000 people that participated in the survey data. But another study involved is what we call the HADS. The HADS was everyone who had served between 2004 and 2009. All of the data sets that we wanted take tremendous leadership support for this type of study, which resulted in about 1 billion data point data set. So you're talking big data. I'm going to talk some about the HADS data, meaning using the historical data for 2004 to 2009. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call the NSS, which is soldiers first coming in, new soldier study, first coming in, who comes into the Army. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the AAS, which is who actually is in the Army. It was designed to do a temperature of the Army about every 3 months. We captured about 3/4 of all the soldiers coming in for about 2 years into the Army for those 2 studies. We also collected blood and did neurocognitive testing, and those are the 8 studies, which I won't go through in detail. So who comes into the Army? So at enlistment, 14% reported lifetime suicide ideation, and nearly 2% had made a suicide attempt. What does that tell us? They look like the US population. It's not like when you enlist in the Army, you leave behind all the problems that you had. You bring them in with you. I would also comment that all this data was collected as a research study under IRB with protections for the soldiers to tell us, none of the data being released on an individual level to their commands of the military. But what about those that are already in the Army? So this is this one where we go and we actually, University of Michigan, went around to 50 different sites in the United States, outside the United States, from Korea to Germany, including what we call the in-theater study, which was planned to be in Iraq and Afghanistan, but ended up being in Kuwait as soldiers went back and forth transiting through there. So those in the Army, 13.9 report lifetime suicide ideation. and about 2.5% report a lifetime suicide attempt. More than half of the transitions from ideation to attempt occurred within a year. In fact, the longer you have suicide ideation, the less likely you are to attempt. This studying the transitions between ideation, plans, and attempts, and what predicts transition becomes an important piece of aiding us in both delivering care and identifying who, when, where is the risk. It's also clear that the predictors for suicide ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide completion are different. So we would be better off thinking about them as different disorders, not all together. Think of them as different disorders with transitions between them, not as one big piece of the pie. Well, everyone was concerned about, of course, the contribution of deployment to risk for suicide. So these graphs are green is those soldiers, this is the historical data, 2004 to 2009. So this is 1.6 million soldiers during that period of time, and this is big data analysis. So this is soldiers who were currently deployed at the time they were deployed. This is soldiers who were previously deployed, and this is soldiers who had never deployed. So you notice it's different. This is the risk across time. This is the suicide rate per 100,000 per year. Suicide rate used to be 12, went up to 23, went up as high as 28, has come back down to about 25. What you notice here, though, is they're all going up. So just as a easy look at the graph statement, deployment is not the whole story, because it doesn't matter whether you were never deployed, whether you're presently deployed, or whether you're previously deployed. The rates went up for all those people. Looks a little different, but it's all going up. A very important finding, which highlights an element of truth. A deployment is not a deployment is not a deployment. It's not deployment that will carry risk. It's got to be something else. Something else. It's not the aspect of actually going overseas that's associated with risk. We have to stop talking about deployment and risk. We have to talk about what elements are involved. So what about suicide deaths? Remember, we have to think about these different. I'm going to talk some about deaths and some about attempts mostly. So this is suicide deaths. This is work done by Ron Kessler. Ron is really the inspiration to the STARS study. He has also been doing what I'll tell you about in a little bit, the machine learning studies. So you'll see here that the rates among soldiers in service for the first 4 years, among those never deployed, 18, currently deployed went up to 31, previously deployed stayed about the same. Now these are not the same people, but you can think a little bit of it that way. These are actually cross-sectional. But notice the rates. So you can also see it here, again, in a graph form. But now what about attempts? That pattern doesn't look the same. In fact, the risk for suicide attempts is highest among those never deployed. You also notice that the rate of attempts is more than 10 times that of completions, which is about correct. 10 to 20 is what you see in most populations. So the rate of attempts here is around 500 per 100,000 per year. And that's highest here, and highest previously deployed, and actually went down substantially among those who are currently deployed. When you look at more detail, and rather than look at it, let me just say there are lots of predictors. They vary. Perhaps the most interesting is to notice that the risk for suicide attempts is in the first 2 years of service being highest. Attempts are, of course, higher in women. Completions are higher in men. And thinking of men and women, if you look at suicide attempt rates, you can see that, in fact, the pattern is somewhat the same for women and men, but not totally. For women, we see the suicide attempt rate goes down among those currently deployed and is still lower for previously deployed. For men, because 80, 90%, 85% of the Army is men, most of the data when you see it collapsed together is about men, This is that pattern that we saw before. But if you ask about completed suicides, notice that actually the difference between women never deployed and women currently deployed, that difference is greater than the difference between men never deployed and men currently deployed. Why is that? We have a whole paper that looked at over a dozen different proposed issues as to why might the effect of deployment be different on women than men. And you can think of 1,000 possibilities. None of the ones that we were able to test stood up. So it remains an interesting question. And keep in mind, a lot of these issues may be explained by who gets deployed. This is not a random sample of people that actually get deployed. Well, who, when are suicide attempts? 90+% of suicide attempts are among enlisted soldiers. This is officers. This is months in the service. And the biggest chunk is here during that first 24 months of service with a peak some very early in service time. You could also ask, who is at risk of suicide attempts? So we looked at who by their military occupation: combat arms, combat medics, special forces, others. In fact, special forces have an inordinate low rate of suicide attempt and of completed suicide. Less than half the rate, 0.3 I believe is what we found in terms of the odds ratio. But the highest risk among these occupations was actually among combat medics. And that risk occurs in a different time trajectory. For combat medics, this is over their first year of service. It's about mid-service time. This is combat arms. This is everybody else. Well, let's talk some about haystacks. We've got maybe 5-6 minutes, and I got to touch on at least one other topic to make sure the book has a closing chapter. Okay, I can see David's flashing me the sign, which is helpful. Haystacks. One of the important ways we've approached data is called concentration of risk. Concentration of risk is a method for studying rare events. It's been used in studying aircraft accidents. What it says is the rate is so low of these events, instead of trying to identify people, what we should do is shrink the haystack of risk. Instead of having 1 out of 1,000 people, maybe we can find 100 people that are at increased risk, even though only a few of those will in fact complete. And then we can administer a treatment to that entire group. Now we do that actually all the time in medicine. We treat entire groups trying to lower the risk and protect a few people that will actually get the disorder. We've done this for 17 different outcomes, suicide just being one of them, things such as early attrition from the military, things such as major violence perpetration, minor violence perpetration. This is machine learning. This is truly big data algorithmic studies. The machine comes up with the predicting equation. The predicting equation itself is actually not very helpful because the equation is chosen based on what are the best predictors. It doesn't answer a question for you about, well, does that tell me we're men, women, older, younger? No, it chooses the one that's the best predictors in a complicated algorithm. So what's the story? High rate of suicide, we've known for many years, occurs among those with a mental health problem who are hospitalized and after they are discharged. That piece of information we've known, particularly over the first year after hospitalization. So we developed a predictive algorithm for post-psychiatric hospital discharge. Remember, the original rate we talked about was about 20 per 100,000 in the Army. Well, using the equation among this population, we can predict, whoops, let's see here, back one. Okay, thank you. We can predict this big number, 3,824 per 100,000. Easy way to think about that, it's about 4%. So we could run this equation. We could say 100 of you in the audience, come and sit here in the front. 4 of you will be dead in a year. 4 of you will be dead in a year. Now, when I say that, What do we have that we can give to 100 people as a mental health intervention that has low side effects, doesn't cost a lot of money, and is highly efficacious? Problem is we don't have anything. Think about this now in terms of medicine, just to put it in the frame so you remember where we are at in mental health. So in medicine, many of you in the audience, I am sure, are taking a statin to lower your cholesterol. We prescribe a statin to you based on an equation. And that equation predicts that 7.5 out of 100 of you will have a called cardiovascular event in the next 10 years. And that cardiovascular event could be a transient ischemic attack, which is a minor thing that goes away. So we're going to treat 100 of you, and in order to help 7.5 over 10 years. So now I'm telling you, we have the ability to identify 4 out of 100 who'll be dead in 100 years, in 1 year, 100 years, 1 year, but we don't have the treatment. We don't have a mental health statin that we can in fact give to people that will accomplish the same. Our ability to predict is getting far beyond our ability to treat, an open area for important work. So let me jump to the last piece of the story. What's the other and? And the and is familiar to you. But remember, there's a past. The diagnosis of concussion of blast syndrome was made in 858 and is believed to be considerably greater than is actually the case. In this connection, it's interesting to note the disagreement between the reports submitted, yada, 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 yada. What are we looking at? Europe, 1945, traumatic brain injury, concussion. There are, in fact, an estimated 1.7 million traumatic brain injuries in the United States every year. I'm sure there is many here. Those range from serious motor vehicle accidents to concussions on the sports fields of adolescents and high school. All of them can have syndromic events afterwards. This is a wonderful slide by Murray Steen, one of our co-PIs on the STARS study from UC San Diego. And what's important about it is to note that many of the areas of vulnerability for traumatic brain injury are similar to those from post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember, other. So what's the relationship of TBI and suicide? So now we jump back to look at soldiers in the Army, the AAS. And we ask them about, in detailed, essentially interviews, although they are surveys, but designed in a complicated manner to walk the person through the time course of their life and when symptoms began and what disorders. And we have a fairly strong validity belief in the diagnoses that we come up with. They are survey-based, not clinical-based, but they are CITI. They are the same ones being used by the WHO. We know that having had a TBI prior to a mental disorder, if you've had a TBI, you're about 50% greater risk of developing a whole range of mental disorders. If you look at it the other way around and you ask, well, do mental disorders predict TBI? The data isn't quite as strong. The bold means that it's significant and one should think more deeply about it. But let's think about suicide ideation. Now remember, in this data, we're able to ask the person, when did you first have your obsessions? When did you get your concussion on your sports field? And when was the onset of your suicide ideation? Those are all asked by age to try and lay this out. What we find is that, in fact, having had a TBI, after controlling for everything we can imagine to control for, including mental disorder, you remain at a 50% greater risk of developing suicide ideation and suicide plans, maybe not suicide attempts. So TBI is an important start to this other chapter, the idea of traumatic stress and other related disorders. The future may be more in the other related disorders for those that are our students and our children. At the moment, we're trying to solve the first part of that chapter, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's an honor and pleasure to be here with you to help think about that together. Thank you all.